what I'm going to teach you today is how to pick up a new skill quickly and enjoy yourself. So I have come to learn that people have different dispositions, and I would think that everybody would love this, but no, I hope this is useful to most of you. I personally love to pick up new things, and I like the challenge of taking on something new. And I've been exploring this year how to do that more efficiently and faster because there's so many things I want to know how to do. I want to be able to do that better. So I thought I'd share that with you. So I'm not talking about necessarily huge things, but I'm also not talking about tiny things either. So I gave some examples here of things you would maybe tackle with this methodology. And the important thing is it could be something that's just kind of a hobby to entertain you. Scott and I have been doing a lot of woodworking the last couple of years. Like I sort of applied this methodology to that, and it's just for fun. But it also could be applied to a skill for doing your job to make you better at your profession. And I have applied it there as well. So you could use this tactic either way. But either way you slice it, the point is basically this framework is not necessarily for becoming an expert. That's different. This is for becoming good enough to either enjoy yourself, if that's a hobby, and just do your hobby sort of without having to struggle and have a good time, or good enough that you could say to, on your resume, hey, I have this skill. So that's what I'm talking about here. So this is, Malcolm Gladwell wrote about this in Outliers, and the point is research shows that people who are at the top of their field, it takes 10,000 hours of practice to get there. I hear this applied a lot to getting good at things, and it's great. The thing is, to be proficient at something is not the same as becoming world class, and the 10,000 hours principle applies to becoming world class. And what I'm talking about here is more like 20 to 40 hours, and you can become good enough at doing something to enjoy it or to make it a marketable part of your skill set in tens of hours, not 10,000. You also don't have to spend a ton of money on it or go back to school or be a genius. Like you can pick up new skills to the point where you enjoy them with not a whole lot. And there's just a few things that you do need. So one is a significant enough desire to pick up the new thing. I'll get into that more in a minute. You need to know exactly what it is that you're trying to pick up. And you need to have the right set of tools. And you see I bolded right. You can also get a bunch of stuff that is, on the spectrum of not helpful to actually counterproductive. So you need the right tools, and then you just need some time to work on it. So this is a framework that I took from a book called The First 20 Hours by Josh Kaufman. I love Josh Kaufman. He also wrote another great book that I love called The Personal MBA. But this is basically where the framework that I'm about to show you came from. And I'm going to do just a little bit on each of these 10 things. But basically, if you dissect something you're looking to pick up using these 10 things, I think that, and I have applied this to a few, and I'll maybe talk about some of those things, you can pick it up enough to enjoy yourself in 20 to 40 hours. So the first thing is to pick something you really enjoy. If you're more excited about picking up a skill you want to acquire, you will just naturally pick it up faster. An example is we've been getting into how to do some live streaming stuff, and I've been really excited about it. Well, I've learned a lot about how to do that without a whole lot of effort per se. I have put time into it, but it hasn't felt like effort because I was excited. As a counterexample, I've tried to learn to be a programmer no less than 5 times. I even tried to get a software engineering degree and failed because the fact is I just don't actually want to do that. I think it could be useful. I think it would be beneficial to me, but I have never really made it on that one because I don't actually want to. So the first is to pick something that and so there's, I think, 2 reasons why you could really want to and feel excited about it. One is it's a hobby that you'll enjoy. The other is like if this is a business skill, if you're going to become a better marketer by learning XYZ skill, then you can get excited by the possibility of being more marketable, of having grounds to request a raise, so on and so forth. But whatever it is, some reason to be excited about this project. The next one is to not spread yourself too thin. So we know that there's this concept called attention residue, which essentially means each time you move on from one task to another one, and this is especially applicable in multitasking, some of your attention is stuck on the last thing you were focusing on. And each time you switch contexts and start working on a new thing, you're less effective. Your capacity is lower than it was before. And this is why multitasking is so bad. By the time you've switched windows 5 times to focus on answering a message and then checking the news and then whatever, by the time you get to the 5th thing, you're half as useful as you were before. That applies to learning skills too. So if you try to learn to play guitar and fly fish and fly a helicopter at the same time, it's not going to go very well. So you want to focus on one skill at a time. And in the chunks of time we're talking about here, you don't have to have a whole ton of patience before you can move on to the next thing. If you're talking 20 to 40 hours, and then you're like, okay, I've got the level of proficiency with that I want to start acquiring something new. One concept that I have used here, because I have so many ideas and things that I want to learn, is a someday maybe list. And this comes from David Allen's Getting Things Done methodology. And it's basically a place to get that off of your mind and say, I'm going to note this down because it's interesting and I like it, but acknowledge that I'm not going to do it right now. And then you can just revisit that in the future and pick something off of it to do next. But there's a mental tax to holding that in your brain. And if you can just put it down somewhere and say, I'm going to table this for right now, but it's not unimportant, and I will consider coming back to it later. That helps. So you're not saying, no, I'm not going to acquire this skill. It's, I'm going to wait. Acquiring a good understanding of your target performance level is going to be really important because you need to know what success looks like. So I think the key here is to set the bar pretty low. A good example would be like, if I'm gonna, let's say I'm gonna build a birdhouse because I'm trying to learn how to do woodworking. If I can do that, then I've got the skill enough to enjoy myself. I'm not talking about building this, super complex, $3,000 project, because setting the bar too high is counterproductive and can be discouraging. You want to set it pretty low so that you feel like you can get a win, and just at the threshold where it's uncomfortable for you and you have to stretch to get there. But once you get to that threshold, now you kind of are at the level where you can enjoy yourself or be proficient at the task. Important key is to not look at the whole thing you want to learn, but to deconstruct it into specific sub-skills for the purpose of deciding which sub-skills are most important. So in the example of golf, you got to figure out which club you're going to use. You got to practice hitting from different spots on the hole. And you might find that there's other sub-skills like raking the sand in the bunker and hailing the beer cart. And all of those are a part of the game of golf, but you might say, okay, it's really, really important to know which club I should use. And it's going to take me way too many strokes to get to the hole if I don't have a good drive. So I'm going to focus on those two things first, and maybe it's not so important to know how to hail the beer cart. If we're trying to compress skill acquisition into, say, 20 hours, you've got to basically give a disproportionate amount of attention to the most fundamental skills, sub-skills, and ignore some that may not be that relevant. Because to get to a level of proficiency where you can enjoy yourself, you only really need to master those, kind of critical sub-skills, and the rest can come later while you're enjoying yourself. But you got to get over the hump of not having this skill. So focusing in on those. So when it comes to tools, I think it's important to think this through before you get started, because there are some skills that you would like to acquire for which the barrier to entry is pretty high. So for example, Keith is a pilot. When Keith wanted to learn how to fly, Keith's got to get time in a plane, which is not particularly easy to do compared to say Al likes to play tennis. When Al wanted to learn how to play tennis, he just needs a tennis racket and a ball and a net, and it's pretty easy to do. So when you're selecting a skill, think through what are the most important tools to get this done. So I don't play tennis, but I bet there's all kinds of like tennis companies selling the latest tennis gadget or a little thing you put on your shoe to make you a better tennis player. And you could get interested in all of that stuff too. But when you're looking at skill acquisition here, it's like, what are the 3 fundamental things I need? And then get those and get a decent one. So don't get one that's so fancy that if you decide after 20 hours you don't like this skill, you just wasted a bunch of money. At the other end of the spectrum, though, if you get really cheapy stuff, you're going to have a frustrating experience and maybe not master the skill as quickly as you could. So back to the example of woodworking. I don't know if you had this experience, Scott, but if you buy cheap tools, it makes it a little more frustrating, and you don't even know that it's that frustrating. You might just think woodworking is no fun until you get a nice one and you're like, oh, this is actually not that hard when you have a nice tool.
And a nice tool and the right tool, absolutely. Yeah,
right.
And I've made that mistake.
It's a balance between, you got to be kind of in the middle there. A good solid tool that's going to help you get good at this skill, but not so far on either end of the spectrum that it's not useful. You also want to think through, is there anything that by not having it I could really get stuck here? So one area where I applied this methodology was when I was a kid, I really enjoyed fishing with my grandparents. And since I was maybe 12 until now, I don't think I've fished again. And just recently, I decided I wanted to learn how to fish. Well, there's some obvious things in there, like you need a fishing pole. And I could have guessed that you were going to need a worm and some hooks. But I didn't do this part, and I didn't go research what are the foundational tools. And so I got out there and I'm fishing and I catch a fish. And then I realize, oh, I have no tools to like get this fish off of the hook humanely. And had I done this task, I would have known maybe I should have some like needle nose pliers, or maybe I should have I forget what it's called. Evan, you might be able to tell me. It's like D something to get the hook out of there without hurting the fish. At the end of the day, I hurt the fish because I didn't do the research. So you got to think through this. Next is to eliminate the barriers to practice. So we know that willpower is very finite, and all of us are doing a lot here and amazing things at ATM, and that takes a bunch of your willpower. There's only so much left to acquire a new skill, and so you want to do everything you can come up with to do to reduce friction in your practice. So an example is, I don't know if you can see behind me here, my bass guitar is sitting right here by me. I used to keep this put away and get it out when I wanted to practice, but what ended up happening is I never practice, because if I want to practice for 10 minutes, but there's 15 minutes of setup and teardown on either side of that, I end up not doing it because the amount of time it takes is more than I have, or I just don't feel like going through all that effort. So, my office is a disaster, but at the same time, I can pick that up and start playing it right now. I have 2 desks in here, so I can pop over there and start podcasting or doing the live shows right now. And there's no friction to doing it. Another thing to consider is back to the example of Keith's plane. If Keith has to schedule time in a plane that he has to rent, and he's learning, so he's probably got to get on the schedule with an instructor, all this stuff, that can be a challenge. And maybe you would consider taking up something like tennis, where Al can go to the tennis court anytime, night or day, and hit some balls, and there's no real constraints there. Environmental distractions is like TV, teams dinging at you. In my case, maybe it's like little kids that want my attention. So I would try and pick a time that maybe they're already in bed, and I would get away from TV and the computer, because back to the willpower thing, trying to even block that out because it's on, even if I'm trying to focus, is sucking up some of my willpower. And so the effectiveness of my focused practice is kind of limited by the amount of willpower I have left. And the last thing is emotional blocks. So that's, fear, doubt, embarrassment about not having this task yet. And that ties back to setting the bar low enough and setting yourself up for feeling confident in doing this. So make small, kind of easily achievable milestones for yourself. so that you don't get stuck in this like, well, I don't feel good at it, so it's no fun, so I don't want to do it kind of thing. And for me, that's a real struggle. I don't know if any of you have noticed this, but I have a high bar and perfection is what I'm after. And I get really discouraged if I can't do it perfectly. And so setting what success looks like in a very attainable range is important to picking up a new skill. Otherwise, you might get stuck. Finding time to practice is a myth. And my biggest win for doing this is basically putting the time right on my calendar. So if I'm going to try and pick something up, I will pre-commit some time on my calendar where I'm going to practice. And if you're strapped for time and you say, I really want to pick up this skill, but I don't have time to do it, 2 ideas that I have for where to find time is practicing selective ignorance. 2 examples of that in my life are I don't consume news, and I haven't for 5 years, and my life hasn't fallen apart. I'm not saying you should do that, but that's what I do. And if something really important is going on in the world, I'll hear about it, and then I'll go look at that particular thing and become educated on it. You know, when it's time to vote, a couple weeks before it's time to vote, I'll go research everybody, decide who I'm going to vote for, and do it. And I don't have to spend a year exhausted with all these terrible commercials. Another way that I find time is to trade bad habits for good. So maybe I'm in the habit of spending an hour sitting on the couch watching TV to decompress. And maybe there's a skill that I want to acquire that I could do during that same window that maybe also doesn't take a ton of physical energy because it's the end of the day, but I could be productive instead of just vegging out. But I find that if I really sit down and hold myself accountable for my time, I can find time. And I think you could too. As far as how much time, ideally, you would practice in anywhere from like 20-minute chunks to 90-minute chunks, depending on what you're trying to work on. And we'll talk about the clock in a minute, but they don't have to be huge chunks of time either. Silicon Valley loves fail fast. And if you think about learning, that applies here too. The sooner you can get feedback on how you're doing with your newly acquired skill, the sooner you can correct course and learn more. So if it takes too long to get feedback, it's really hard to progress quickly in your craft. So some examples here: cheese, wine, things that have to sit there and age. Parenting, I'm thinking about this right now. Like there are things that I'm doing with my 5-year-old that I won't know whether or not that worked until she's 25. It's just hard to know. On the other hand, you'll know right away if you're staying upright on a bike, or if your guitar playing sounds good, or if you hit the bullseye when you're target shooting. So not that you shouldn't try to take up skills that have longer feedback loops, but I guess first consider what the feedback loops are like. And second, consider, is there any way that you could get faster feedback so that you can progress more quickly? And so if you wanted to pick up something like, say, cheese making, one way to shorten the feedback loop, even though the sort of inherent native one is long, is to get a coach. Get somebody who's an experienced cheesemaker who can look at what you're doing and say, you know, based on what I know, here's some things that you might think about. And that way, rather than having to wait months or years for your cheese to age, you get feedback from your coach almost immediately. I think coach can sound intimidating. That does not have to be a $100 an hour person coach. You might find coaching in a training course or in a forum where you can bounce ideas off of people. Scott loves Reddit. Reddit, in a lot of ways, communities coach each other. And so you can get in a forum where it's a bunch of other cheesemakers and they help you with fast feedback. Practice by the clock. So one of the things that's really hard about picking up a new skill is the emotional resistance when you're no good at it. And so the way to overcome that is to basically set a timer, and it's for, say, something manageable, 15, 20 minutes. I say try a Pomodoro timer, and the default Pomodoro is 25 minutes. So you set the timer and say, I'm going to practice for this short period of time. I'm not going to get distracted with anything else. I'm not going to let my attention move back and forth. I'm just going to focus on this thing for 20 minutes. And when I'm done, then I'm done and I'll move on to the next thing. Because when something is totally miserable because you're not good at it yet, you know that a minute feels like an hour. And so it's important to actually put in the time and not just feel like you're putting in the time. That's where the clock comes in. You want to measure that and make sure that you're actually practicing for as long as you think you're practicing. Lastly, volume matters here most of the time. If it's tennis, it's, hit lots and lots of balls, play lots and lots of matches. In the case of flying the airplane, it's you have to log hours to get your license. Like, get the time in. And importantly, we know about memory and learning that spaced repetition is incredibly effective. So doing the same thing, giving it a rest, do it again. Give it a rest, do it again. And so if you practice that technique over and over, it's going to stick better. The caveat is not to sacrifice technique for quantity and speed. So if Al's working on his serve, it's not hit 1,000 serves at the expense of technique, but it's don't sit there and overanalyze the technique to the point where you hit 3 per practice session. Find the balance there where you're not sacrificing form, but you want to get as many cycles in as you can because you're going to refine and get feedback on each one. Last thing, and I've got a bonus here, sleep on it. We know that varying stages of sleep do different helpful things for learning. So one thing we know is that during the day, all of the things we're learning kind of get cached in short-term storage, and they sit there until we sleep, at which point the function of sleep, or one function of sleep, is to move those to long-term storage. Another function of sleep is to tie new things we've learned back to things we already know so that they stick. And so during REM sleep, your brain is kind of weaving these things together. And we think that that's one of the functions of dreams, is to sort of help integrate the things that we experienced and learned during the day with things that we already know. One tip I thought might be helpful, this is very timely. Jordy, you mentioned the Aura Ring this morning. This is a screenshot from my Aura dashboard, and you can see the stages of sleep here. And I just thought you might be interested to see that this is not an amazing night's sleep. It's long, but not super efficient. But if something's going to go wrong with your sleep, when in the night that something goes wrong impacts what part of your sleep is affected, and thus what sort of impact that has on your learning. So your deep non-REM sleep is concentrated in the front half of the night. And this isn't a super clear example of that. Mine's actually a little bit spread out, but typically before about 2 a.m. is very heavily concentrated in deep sleep. And then REM sleep is concentrated towards the other end between the, say, 4 and 8 a.m. window. And then the light sleep, which is also important, is kind of scattered throughout. So, if you're in learning mode and you're trying to take in lots and lots of new stuff, you want to be careful not to go to bed too late or get up too early, or you risk cutting off one of these really important windows where either your memories are being integrated or your cache is being cleared so that you can take up more stuff the next day. See my note here that there's a 40% drop measured in some studies in learning capacity from impaired deep sleep. So the night before the study, their sleep was interrupted. Their ability to learn new things and take in new information the next day was impaired by as much as 40%. So all of the 10 things before applied are not as useful if you don't get a good night's sleep. So I'm going to upload my PDF of this presentation and share it with you. I have a bunch of other books here. You guys know I love to read. These are all relevant on this topic. And the second one here, the first 20 hours, is the one I mentioned where the framework came from. So there we go. Hope that was useful to you. And I would love to discuss this more if anybody wants to chat about it.